So we're going to get started. So welcome. Today our presentation is Research Ready, Extending the Cognitive Health Span. So Nathan, you can go to the next slide. So hi everyone and welcome to today's webinar. So my name is Avery Milne. I'm the Provincial Coordinator for Knowledge Mobilization here at the Alzheimer Society of B.C. At the Society, we receive many questions about research related to dementia, and we're always looking for ways to act as a knowledge translator and bring research findings into the hands of knowledge users like yourselves. So in that spirit, we're thrilled to be hosting a local researcher, Nathan Lewis, today to share his exciting research. So a bit about Nathan. Nathan is a PhD candidate in lifespan health and development in the Department of Psychology at the University of Victoria. He's originally from Ottawa, where he completed his BA and MA degrees in psychology from Carleton University. Nathan first became interested in healthy aging while working at a retirement community beginning as a teenager. Working closely with older adults in this setting led him to pursue research aimed at identifying factors that may help individuals maintain cognitive health and well-being across the lifespan. So Nathan's research interests cover a broad range of topics, from psychological adaptation to significant life events such as retirement or the onset of a serious health condition, to the influence of cardiovascular and immune markers on cognitive functioning and decline. His PhD research is supported by the Alzheimer Society of Canada's Alzheimer Society Research Program and is focused on the potential for mental stimulation across the lifespan to promote resilience to cognitive impairment, as well as the use of quantitative methods to facilitate early detection of cognitive decline. So thank you, Nathan, for being here today and sharing your research insights with us. I will note that I will be monitoring the chat box throughout and collecting questions to pose to Nathan at a question period in the middle of the presentation as well as the end. So please feel free to type questions in the chat box as they come up for you. And now I'd like to pass things on to Nathan.
All right, so thank you, Avery, for the introduction. And also like to say thank you for the Alzheimer Society of BC for allowing me to speak today. As many people have been stuck inside for the last 4 months, so it'll be nice to share my own research and talk to someone that isn't my cat. He's starting to get sick of hearing about my own research. So again, thank you so much. So a bit of an overview of what I'm hoping to discuss today. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the current dementia trends and some of the projections. And I'm going to go a bit into the neuropathology of Alzheimer's disease, so what Alzheimer's disease looks like in the brain. And then I'll transition into talking about the cognitive reserve hypothesis and how some aspects, lifestyle characteristics may help people become more resilient to these brain changes. And I'll talk a little bit about how people have tried to quantify cognitive reserve. It's a fairly difficult thing to look at, so I'll touch on that. And wrapping up with discussing some of my own research and trying to promote cognitive reserve across the lifespan. So a bit of a background, Alzheimer's disease and related dementias represent one of the most costly diseases in terms of the annual care costs. So in Canada alone, there's about $10.4 billion spent annually, that's every year, on caring for people with dementia. And worldwide, this number is almost $1 trillion US. So this is a little concerning given that with current population aging trends, we're expected to see a fairly large increase in the number of people with dementia. So this figure on the right here comes straight from the World Health Organization. And basically, they estimate by around 2050, there could be as many as 120 million people worldwide living with the disease. So I've included this not to scare people, but to really highlight the need for research that can help potentially mitigate the impact of dementia on not only care costs, but also the well-being of people and their loved ones as they live with the disease. So in particular, since there's currently no known cure for Alzheimer's disease, and there's at the moment, no great way to try to slow the disease progression down.
Nathan, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a something right in the middle of your screen that is preventing us from being able to see the slide. Good.
That's better.
Much.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. So yes, at the moment, there's no known cure for Alzheimer's disease. So in this case, focusing on research on identifying ways to try to prevent dementia, as well as delaying the onset of dementia, represents an important target for research. I'm also seeing something there. So there's been some interesting studies that have suggested that delaying the onset of impairment can have, just trying to quantify the value in delaying onset of cognitive impairment. So one study found that just delaying onset of impairment by 1 year would decrease the projected number of people with dementia in 2050, that figure that I showed in the last slide of about 120 million, by about 9.2 million. It's a pretty significant decrease in the number of people living with dementia. Another study tried to estimate the financial costs. So about a 5-year delay in onset of cognitive decline was associated with $500,000 decrease in care costs per person. This was in the United States. These are pretty significant numbers, and a little more difficult to quantify. You also have to consider the potential benefits for well-being. If people are able to live longer without the disease, that's more time they're able to spend with their family and less time spent in care settings and other facilities. So a bit of a background on some of what we see in the brain of people with Alzheimer's disease. So what I mean by neuropathology is basically some type of disease marker, and neuro specifically in the brain. So there's two main hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, these being amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. So as you can see in the figure on the right here, these amyloid plaques represent this kind of dense clump of amyloid protein that forms between neurons. And the neurofibrillary tangles are these kind of tangle bits of another protein called tau, which usually helps to form an important structure and provide stability to the neuron, especially the axon projection. But when this breaks down, they tend to clump together and can actually damage or even cause the neuron to die. So another feature we see is in the section C, on the figure on the right here, typically you see brain shrinkage or cortical shrinkage. So the person on the far right is the brain of someone with severe Alzheimer's disease. You can see it's shrunk considerably compared to someone without the disease. And you also see enlarging of the ventricles, which are typically filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So an important point here is that these changes typically start fairly early, considering when people are actually diagnosed. So there's been some studies to suggest that these changes may happen as early as 2 decades prior to actual diagnosis and onset of cognitive impairment. So for this entire time, these plaques and tangles seem to be accumulating in the brain, but you actually tend to not see much in terms of cognitive symptoms. So it's not until it gets to a certain point that you actually show signs of cognitive impairment. So we've known about brain plaques being associated with dementia for a long time, basically since the early 1900s when Alzheimer's disease was first discovered. But the technology hasn't been there to look at these plaques and tangles in much detail up until about the late 1980s and early 1990s, where advances in chemical staining allowed researchers to identify these plaques and tangles in the brains of people who had passed away. So this is at autopsy. So a lot of the research at this time being able to identify plaques and tangles in the brains of people who had passed away led to a lot of research trying to identify or trying to link these brain-related changes to what we see in terms of changes in cognition. So a common question at the time was, is there a minimum threshold for a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease if you just consider what you see in the brain? So would it be possible to take a snapshot and identify that this person has Alzheimer's disease versus someone who has fewer of the plaques and tangles who likely doesn't? So a big challenge with this is that this relationship between what we see in the brain and what we see in terms of cognitive impairment is not a one-to-one relationship. And in fact, even with modern brain imaging techniques, which are a lot better than what we've had in the past, we're still able to, based on what we see in the brain, that only accounts for about half of the differences in cognitive functioning and cognitive change in older adults and people with dementia. And on the other hand, you also see a fairly large number of people, a few studies have suggested somewhere between 25 to 35% in some cases, of older adults who live fairly normal, healthy lives. They don't show signs of cognitive impairment, but when they eventually pass away and you look at their brains, you see fairly significant levels of these pathological markers in the brain. So something there happened where they developed the disease in the brain at the neuronal level, but they didn't actually express the kind of cognitive impairment aspect of the disease. So a lot of the early studies theorize that this might be something related to differences in brain size. So people who have larger brain size may just be better able to cope with more pathology in the brain. So we do know that that does account for some of the discrepancy, but definitely not all. So for example, men tend to have larger brains on average, just tending to be a bit larger physically, having a larger body size. But we don't see much in terms of sex differences between men and women in this discrepancy. So there's obviously something else that's at play here, which is what led to the cognitive reserve hypothesis. So a fundamental component of this hypothesis is that there's no kind of one-to-one relationship between what we see in the brain and the actual clinical manifestation of the damage in the brain. So basically the cognitive impairment and cognitive decline. So this term cognitive reserve was created to describe some aspect of the brain's ability to adapt and compensate and change in the face of damage to try to promote functioning, even if the brain is experiencing fairly considerable damage and dysfunction. So a lot of the research in this area suggests that it's some aspects of people's lifestyle. So for example, education is a really probably the most common predictor. So aspects of their lifestyle, like education, may allow people to become more resilient and adapt to these changes. So basically, people higher in cognitive reserve, they don't have anatomically different brains, but they're able to process tasks a bit more efficiently and better cope with these plaques and tangles as they're building up in the brain. So in the figure I've included on the left here, in the y-axis, it says brain reserve capacity. You can just think of that as brain size. So this represents two patients in this case. They both have kind of similar size brains, but patient one is able to tolerate a lot more pathology represented by the dashed lines before they actually show signs of cognitive impairment compared to someone who's lower in cognitive reserve, like patient two. And I should also mention that this is not limited just to Alzheimer's disease. There's a pretty large literature out there looking at cognitive reserve and things like traumatic brain injury or stroke. It seems to be that any type of disease or damage to the brain, cognitive reserve plays a role in how the brain is able to compensate and adapt. There's even some interesting research in the schizophrenia literature that suggests that as individuals start to develop schizophrenia, as their brain changes slightly in ways that we still don't fully understand, cognitive reserve might actually play a role in kind of reducing the impact of these brain changes on the typical symptoms that you expect in people with schizophrenia. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to be focusing mostly on Alzheimer's disease and a bit on other types of dementia. I'm not going to go into the larger literature, but just know that this is not something that's strictly limited to Alzheimer's disease. So a really important implication of cognitive reserve is how it impacts the trajectories of cognitive decline in people who do end up developing dementia. So people higher in cognitive reserve tend to have later onset of cognitive decline. So as you can see in the figure on the right here, the top line represents someone who would be higher in reserve. So they have a much later point of inflection, as it's labeled in this diagram here, which means that's the point in which their cognition starts to decline. However, once they actually start to experience that cognitive decline, they tend to decline much steeper, actually. So they have a much faster rate of decline and tend to be diagnosed and progress a lot faster. So the reason for this is that if you kind of consider a snapshot of someone with high reserve and low reserve, what it looks like in their brain at the time of when they're diagnosed, the person with high cognitive reserve is much farther along in terms of brain pathology than someone lower in cognitive reserve. So they almost represent like a more advanced disease state. So just an example to try to drive home this discrepancy that we see between the brain and the actual observable cognitive functioning. One study that we ran recently in our lab used data from the Memory and Aging Project, which is an amazing study where everyone involved in the study agrees to donate their brain when they eventually pass away. So this is out of Chicago in the United States. So these individuals all agree to donate their brains. Once they eventually pass away, their brains undergo autopsy and they look at the level of pathological burden, things like amyloid plaques, neurofibrillary tangles, as well as signs of stroke and other potential brain damage. But this whole time before they pass away, they're undergoing annual cognitive testing. They answer questions about lifestyle, physical activities, that sort of thing. So it's a pretty rich study in terms of having a lot of assessments for sometimes up to 20 years of cognitive tests, as well as information on what their brains look like. So we ran a latent class analysis, which is basically, it's a statistical analysis, which basically clusters people together based on a set of variables. So the variables that we looked at were different types of brain pathology and the level of brain pathology that they observed. So we found the strongest evidence for a 4-group latent class analysis. So thankfully, the most common group were people who passed away who had very low levels of pathology. This was, by and large, the largest group. But we also saw people who had more moderate levels of Alzheimer's disease-related pathology, as well as a group that was fairly high in plaques and tangles. And then a 4th group that showed higher levels of vascular pathology. So these are things like signs of stroke or microstrokes and cerebrovascular disease. So while these people were grouped together based on what their brains looked like, so they had similar brains at the time of death, they had actually had fairly different cognitive outcomes when we looked at their life prior to passing away. So on the 3rd line of this chart here, the MMSE it's a cognitive screening tool. It's out of 30. Typically, people should be scoring very high on this measure. So we see here that these scores in the MMSE typically, as you might expect, follow along with the level of pathology that people are showing in the brain when they pass away. But this wasn't the case for everyone. There was actually quite a bit of variability within these groups, and some people in the high AD pathology group had much higher MMSE scores than you might expect. And importantly, when we actually consider dementia diagnosis prior to passing away, there were, so for individuals in the high AD pathology group, there were almost 20% of these individuals who you would expect them to probably show some signs of cognitive impairment, but they were never diagnosed with dementia while they were alive. They never showed, they lived their entire life without showing significant signs of cognitive impairment. And then as well, you see in the low pathology group, these are people who mostly have fairly low levels of pathology, yet there's about 30% of the sample that were diagnosed with dementia before they passed away. So what we're interested in is what explains these within group differences. These are people who have very similar levels of pathology, but different cognitive outcomes. So when we ran within group analyses, just specifically looking at the low pathology group and the high pathology group, we found that social and cognitive activities earlier in life accounted for some of these within group differences. So in the low pathology group, we found that being very socially and cognitively active earlier in life was associated with a nearly 50% reduced risk of dementia compared to people in that same group who were lower in these activities. And similarly for the high AD pathology group, cognitive activities, this was a much smaller group, so it was a bit more difficult to find significant effects in this group, but we found that cognitive activities were associated with reduced dementia risk, just specifically looking within this cluster. So there definitely seems to be some aspect of lifestyle characteristics and cognitive mental stimulation that seem to be protecting people from levels of pathology. So I think this is hopefully a good time. If there are any questions, I want to take a pause here because I've gone through some fairly complicated neuroscience and related topics so far. So I want to ask if there are any questions that people had before I move on to talking about more neuroscience and some of the mechanisms.
Perfect. So there's no questions so far in the chat box, Nathan, but let's give people a moment or two. If you'd like to type any questions that have come up so far during Nathan's presentation, feel free to do so in the chat box. If you're on the phone, you can unmute yourself and press *6 if you'd like to ask your question verbally. And we'll just take a quick pause here to see if there's any questions. Okay, so there's no questions at this time. If they come up as we go through the webinar, feel free to type them in the chat box. We'll have a longer question period at the end. But Nathan, I think that means that you've done a great job explaining it so far, so that's great. So feel free to keep going there. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so that's a good sign, I guess. So going into some of the mechanisms behind cognitive reserve. So these are actually not all that well understood at the moment. And the reason for that is that a lot of these changes that we expect to happen in the brain are happening at a very small level, at the neuronal level. And this is a little difficult to identify changes that have occurred kind of throughout and build up throughout the lifespan. And trying to see those changes in the brain at such a small level, it's a little challenging. But I'll outline two theories that people have put forward that might explain cognitive reserve. And I need to apologize for the first one because it's a very confusing term, neural reserve, where the person who named it decided to make it very similar to cognitive reserve itself. But the idea behind neural reserve is that as people live their life and maybe get higher education or are more cognitively active, they're building up these synaptic connections, these branches from the neurons, as you can see in the figure on the right here, that connect all these different neurons and allow it to pass on messages. So the idea here is that these lifestyle characteristics allow people to have more efficient and denser neural networks. So if one neuron is damaged or dies, they're able to bypass that neuron through these denser connections. So the way I like to think about it is almost like city streets. So if there's construction on one street, having a lot of different side streets and different connections, way to move around and detour around the construction would allow you to kind of maintain the same route, get to the same destination without having too much of a delay. So another theory is that these individuals may also compensate for damage in some areas of the brain. So people higher in cognitive reserve may be more adept at recruiting different brain regions to perform the same kind of cognitive function, or they may use slightly different cognitive strategies to kind of get to the same, to perform the same cognitive tasks. So this is compensating for damage by working around and using different brain regions or different cognitive strategies. So just to go into a little bit about some of the predictors of cognitive reserve, I mentioned education already, and that's because this is by far the most commonly studied predictor of cognitive reserve. It's the one that was first discovered. It's the one that is most common. You most commonly see it in the literature as predicting cognitive reserve. Sometimes a little too much so. So some people, I've seen some studies where people say they looked at cognitive reserve, but they just looked at education as a predictor of cognitive functioning in older adulthood, which is not exactly the same, but it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine. I'm not going to go into it too further. Another predictor of cognitive reserve is job complexity or job rank. So the theory here is that it works in a similar way to education. This is something that happens a bit earlier in the lifespan, but it kind of reflects your daily activities and how mentally stimulated you are at a day-to-day level. And another one is IQ, or sometimes literacy or markers of vocabulary. And the idea here is that this, again, represents kind of your cumulative experiences across the lifespan. So how representing intelligence or acquired knowledge throughout the lifespan. And in particular, vocabulary tends to be less affected in the early stages of dementia. So this is something that people typically build upon their vocabulary pretty continuously throughout their lifespan. So that's why a lot of people like this as a predictor of cognitive reserve, because it represents this kind of lifelong acquired knowledge and acquired vocabulary. And the last 2 points I wanted to address in a bit more detail. So mental stimulation or cognitive activities, as well as social engagement. So I've included this slide because through my work, I often travel to the States for conferences or travel abroad. And pretty much the first question I get when I pass through security and they ask what I do and I hand them in my passport is, what should I be doing to try to decrease my risk for Alzheimer's disease? Or should I be playing brain games? Things like that. So I tend to shy away from providing really specific advice about, like, yes, you should be playing Sudoku every day or something like that. Because again, this is a very personal thing, and it really depends on what you are personally interested in, what you're able to do on a day-to-day level. So what I wanted to outline here were 4 different criteria that you might look for in a cognitive activity. So the first one being something that is multimodal or multisensory. So this is something that involves coordination between different senses or different brain regions. And that just adds that extra bit of complexity in that you maybe have to visually interpret something, or process it in a different way before speaking, for example, as well as something that is a bit more dynamic. So this is something that involves mental flexibility, requires you to basically think on your toes and constantly adapt, and something that can actually be continuously challenging for you. I think that's a really important aspect. And this third point here, very simple but important. It has to be interesting. It has to be personally interesting to you. So this is why I don't go recommending specific puzzles or things like that, because I don't know what people are interested in. If Sudoku or reading is your thing, that's great. That's something that can be cognitively stimulating. But if it's not, there are certainly other types of activities that you could do as well. So really finding something that's interesting that you're more likely to maintain and keep doing for a long period of time. And the fourth point, something that is social. So if you can incorporate a social aspect to an activity, that adds a bit of extra complexity in that you are interacting with other people. You may have to listen or interpret what they're saying or adapt to what they're doing. So one example I wanted to use to kind of work through these is, it's not something that people would typically think of as a cognitive activity, but say playing a musical instrument. So this is multisensory in that you may have to, say, read sheet music, which you then interpret in your brain and then use to kind of coordinate your movements if you're playing an instrument, or coordinate your jaw movements if you're singing. And it's also dynamic. You have to be constantly listening for changes in tempo, adjusting your pitch, that sort of thing. And hopefully it's interesting, and it often involves a social component, like people tend to play music in groups. So what I was hoping to drive home with this slide is that it doesn't have to be, mentally stimulating activities aren't just limited to sitting down and reading or playing Sudoku. There are other types of activities that you may not think of as being cognitive, but involve mental stimulation. So things like playing team sports, martial arts are very physical activities, but they also involve cognitive flexibility and constantly adapting. So a few other predictors of reserve, these are a little newer in the literature. So bilingualism, there's a growing body of research to suggest that speaking multiple languages may actually help to promote reserve, and that there's a bit of redundancy in the brain, that people are learning similar things across different languages, which does involve slightly different brain regions, depending on when they've learned the language, as well as purpose in life. So believing that your life has some direction, you're driven towards certain activities, those individuals tend to have higher cognitive reserve. And I've also included physical activity here. There's an asterisk next to it because the mechanisms underlying physical activity and reserve aren't as well understood. So the reason I mention this is that physical activity is probably the best thing you can do to try to reduce your risk for dementia and just overall promote better health. Physical activity, there's been some research to show that physical activity may actually decrease your risk for the amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles in the first place. So this is why it's a little uncertain if it's a predictor of reserve or if it just kind of makes you less likely to develop these pathological markers in the first place. So people who are more physically active tend to have better blood flow, better cerebrovascular blood flow, which may help to improve immune response, may help to kind of flush out these proteins before they build up in the brain. But there also is some literature that suggests that above and beyond those benefits, it may also help people adapt in the face of pathology. So while I've covered a number of different predictors of cognitive reserve, a major limitation of this work so far of this research is that few of these studies have actually directly compared multiple predictors of reserve. A lot of the research will look at something like education or vocabulary, but typically not together. So it's really, at the moment, there's some uncertainty about whether these factors, do they share common mechanisms? Do they represent distinct pathways to try to promote reserve? And one thing that I think is an important question, do these factors, say, interact across the lifespan? So if I have high education and I'm also very cognitively active every day, does this have a greater kind of synergistic effect than if I just had high education or high cognitive activity? So that's an important question moving forward that I've tried to address in some of my research. Considering ways to try to promote reserve across a lifespan. So again, since a lot of the research is focused on education or markers like job complexity, these are things that typically happen earlier in the lifespan. People typically finish education, unless you're me, you typically finish education in younger adulthood. I don't think I'll ever be done, but and as job complexity tends to fall in kind of middle adulthood period, and people retire around age 65. So this is not something that people can easily take up at any stage of the lifespan, for example. And there's often societal level barriers to, say, promoting education at a large scale level. So this is something that often requires societal level changes to promote education. And this is why a lot of my research is focused on potential benefits for mentally stimulating activities, because these are things that can be promoted throughout the lifespan. They can be adapted based on someone's situation, someone's socioeconomic standing. You don't have to be very rich to read a book or engage in different types of cognitive activities. And this last point, I think, is probably the most important. It's something that's modifiable. You can change your lifestyle at any point. So before I go into talking a bit more about that, I want to discuss a few different ways that people have tried to quantify cognitive reserve in the literature. So the first one is people tend to take an interaction approach. This tends to be the most common one. So this is basically a statistical interaction between different reserve proxies like education and markers of brain pathology. So what you get is the effect of education. Does higher levels of education, does that decrease the effect of pathology on cognitive functioning, for example? Another approach is this residual approach. So this involves fitting a model where you have pathology predicting cognitive functioning, and then what's left over, this residual, kind of represents this discrepancy between cognitive functioning that you see in, like, you actually observe in the patients versus cognitive functioning that you would predict based on what the pathological markers look like in their brain. So people whose measured cognitive performance is better than what you would expect based on the pathology are those who have cognitive reserve. And then you can use this term as a predictor. You can use it as an outcome variable to try to break it down and understand what are some lifestyle factors that may explain this residual. So an important point here is that both of these approaches actually require some indicator of brain pathology, which is not available in most studies. And in particular, like large scale studies that are supposed to be representative of the population, it's very difficult to collect biological samples and things like that. So there is it's a challenge to try to combine large scale long-term studies with markers of brain pathology. So one way around this, and this is an approach that I tend to take a bit more frequently, is looking at specifically the trajectory of cognitive decline. So I had mentioned earlier that the typical reserve trajectory is where people have a later onset of cognitive impairment but steeper decline. So this figure on the left, which looks really messy, it's called a spaghetti plot, because basically it looks like you chucked a pot of spaghetti at a wall and it stuck. But each of these lines represents cognitive scores for an individual. And then these thick lines, so the thick blue line in the center represents the kind of mean trend for people who had less than 7 years of education in this example. So this is as a function of time leading up to dementia diagnosis. So people who had less than 7 years of education, they were experiencing onset of decline about 7 years before dementia diagnosis, compared to the green line here, which represents people with 12 or more years of education who are experiencing cognitive decline about 4 years before diagnosis. That's a pretty significant difference. It's about 4 years where these individuals are living longer without any type of cognitive impairment. But again, they do tend to have a steeper rate of decline. So I'm doing a similar study at the moment, looking at, again, social and cognitive activities throughout the lifespan to see how they may interact to influence this inflection point, so the timing in which people first start to show cognitive decline. So getting back to the idea of trying to promote reserve across the lifespan, following a similar approach, one study that we conducted in my lab, we looked at actually childhood as a potential, the influence of childhood mental stimulation and access to cognitive resources in childhood as a predictor for late life cognitive health. So what I mean by cognitive resources are access to number of books in the home, encyclopedias, having a library nearby. So these sort of things, we use these as a proxy for mental stimulation in childhood, because people tend to be better at estimating these concrete things like estimating the size of the bookshelf that you had at home is much easier than people thinking back several decades earlier to think through, okay, how often was I reading at age 10, for example? It's a little more difficult. So in this study, it was a really large study. So we used over 30,000 participants from 10 different European countries. And we found that having these high access to childhood resources, so having high number of books in the home, for example, showed benefits later in life. So these people tend to have later onset of cognitive impairment, about 2.5 years later on average. And they tended to spend less time in a cognitive impaired state. So they tended to progress more quickly until they eventually passed away. It was almost 2 years less time spent with impairment. A similar study, which we kind of built upon this one, looked at cognitive leisure activities at different stages of the lifespan. So in childhood, young adulthood, and middle age. So engagement in activities like reading, writing, visiting museums, playing musical instruments or card games. We found that cognitive activities at each age predicted later onset of cognitive impairment. So again, this delaying the onset of impairment. So in this figure, you can see the pathway from normal cognitive functioning to MCI, which is mild cognitive impairment. So these were in, this is once again in that Chicago study, the Memory and Aging Project, and everyone was clinically diagnosed in this case. So people who had were more cognitively active were less likely to transition from normal cognitive impairment to MCI, to mild cognitive impairment. But since we also had markers of brain pathology, so what their brain looked like when they passed away, we also accounted for that as an interaction with these cognitive activities throughout the lifespan. So what we found is that people who were engaging in high cognitive activities, who also had high pathology at the time of death, were actually more likely to go from normal cognition right to death. So they lived their entire life, an average of almost 90 years, without developing any sort of impairment. And what we also found is that for these people who had high pathology and high cognitive activity, they were also, if they did develop mild cognitive impairment, they were also more likely to show a recovery after the fact. So if they were showing cognitive impairment at 1 year, a few years later, they were more likely to recover slightly. So it definitely seems like this cognitive engagement, this mental stimulation, is providing a protective effect across the lifespan. It's not just limited to critical periods like younger adulthood for education. It seems to be happening throughout life. So a few conclusions I want to drive home here. Hopefully I didn't beat this point too much to death, but cognitive reserve isn't just about education. There are other factors that seem to promote it above and beyond what we see in years of education. And importantly, modifiable lifestyle factors like mental stimulation seem to promote cognitive reserve throughout the lifespan. So this shows promise in that these activities, again, are modifiable. They can be promoted in children, as I showed in that one study, all the way up into older adulthood. So just to outline a few future directions. So you may notice that a lot of the studies I was talking about, these people had already passed away. So the only markers that we had were from brain autopsies. So these people had already passed away, but advances in brain imaging, there constantly being new advancements in this technology, may actually help in the future to capture these changes as they're happening. So in vivo, when these people are still alive, and there may be potential for intervention or ways that they could try to mitigate against development of these plaques and tangles building up in the brain. So the figure that I have on the right here is an example of Pittsburgh compound B. So it's a staining, it's a radioactive dye that gets injected in your bloodstream and actually binds to the amyloid protein. So when you look at someone's brain in a PET image, it actually lights up. You can see in this figure, person on the left is someone with Alzheimer's disease, very bright colors indicating that there's a high degree of deposition of amyloid in the brain compared to someone who does not have Alzheimer's disease. So as these technologies get better and better, we may be better able to capture these smaller scale changes as they're happening. And then a second future direction, which ties into some of my own research, is the use of multi-study analyses to try to examine different predictors and how they may interact across a lifespan. So I mentioned that there are some challenges, some limitations. If you want to look specifically at brain pathology, you tend to have to use smaller, more clinical samples that may not be as representative of the population. But by combining a bunch of different studies, you kind of build upon their different strengths and get a better sense of some of the variety in behaviors and how they may affect cognitive reserve and interact across the lifespan. So this is the topic of my dissertation research, which is thankfully funded by the Alzheimer Society. So another plug there. At this point, I would like to thank everyone for attending. And if there are any questions, now looks like we have quite a bit of time, so I'll be happy to stick around for as long as needed to answer anyone's questions.
Thank you so much, Nathan. I've learned so much from your presentation, and I thought you did a great job at making it accessible, breaking down some of those different terms. So thank you so much. And as Nathan mentioned, we'd love to answer your questions, so feel free to type them away in the chat box. And then in a moment, I'll prompt anyone on the phone, but we'll first do the chat box. Let's see. Okay, we have some questions coming in. Erwin has asked Nathan, how about nutrition on building up cognitive reserve?
Nutrition, that's an interesting one. I haven't seen anything in terms of the cognitive reserve literature. There's quite a bit of research suggesting that nutrition, mostly through its impacts on cardiovascular health. I think I kind of alluded to this a little bit when I talked about physical activity, but heart health isn't just limited to your heart. It's so important for the brain. And having a good diet, having lots of fiber in your diet is definitely linked with better cardiovascular health, which decreases your risk for like mini strokes, cerebrovascular infarcts, but also Alzheimer's disease as well. There's also been some research that I've seen on very specific diets like the Mediterranean diet and things like eating lots of blueberries because of the antioxidant properties. It's definitely not my area of research, so I can't speak to it too much, but from what I've seen, definitely consuming larger number of antioxidants in your diet, having high quality fats in your diet seem to be protective against dementia. But I haven't seen anything in terms of cognitive reserve, so it could be a future topic for research.
Great, thank you so much. We had a similar question, comment on, any evidence of dietary nutritional impact, which you covered, but they also asked about chemical ingestion impact on cognitive reserve. So I think that might mean like, we sometimes get questions about aluminum, so I'm not sure if that's what's being alluded to here, but chemical ingestion impact on cognitive reserve.
Yeah, I think I can speak a little bit to that. So there's some research, again, ingesting some type of toxic chemicals, like there's been some work on heavy metals. It seems to be play somewhat of a risk for Alzheimer's disease and dementia. These thankfully tend to be a bit less common, but this would be something that actually cognitive reserve might help to help promote adaptation in the face of. So if someone has exposure to a heavy metal, this could lead to damage in the brain, but cognitive reserve may help to adapt to that damage.
Perfect, thank you. Another question here. Could you comment on the benefits or detrimental effects of playing video games?
Yeah, so I have to be careful here because I don't want to step on the brain games people too much, but specifically in terms of video games like brain games that are designed to try to promote cognitive health, what we've seen typically is that these are great if you enjoy them, but the actual benefits beyond learning the game, they tend to not transfer as well to cognitive functioning outside of the situation of the game. But again, like I had mentioned in that slide earlier, just even if you're playing like a non-brain game like Call of Duty or something, these are things that do require you to kind of it involves visual processing. You have to coordinate movements to your hands. It is a fairly complicated task, so I don't think it can necessarily hurt, but I think there needs to be a bit more research on potential benefits. And it is, I can say I've seen a few studies recently out there looking at the impact of video games on as a form of cognitive training, for example.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, another question here. Have you noticed in your research that different types of cognitive stimulation for risk reduction are linked to different types of dementia?
Wow, another good question.
I know, we're getting some good ones.
Yeah, so I think as I alluded to earlier, there are limitations to the cognitive reserve literature. A lot of the research, like I had mentioned, is focused specifically on education. So there really hasn't been much to get into the specifics in terms of what aspects of certain activities might be better than others. And I think that's something that this literature needs to get into a bit more if we're really to use cognitive reserve as something that to try to promote in people. So I don't have the best answer for that in terms of specifics about what's the best activity, for example, but I think that's certainly something that needs to be a focus.
Great, thank you. Okay, I found this question really interesting, so I'm curious to hear your answer. Does there appear to be a difference in the benefits of reading fiction versus nonfiction?
Ooh, that's interesting. So yeah, fiction versus nonfiction, you definitely have a difference in terms of the involvement of imagination, I guess. But I think both reading fiction and nonfiction do require quite a bit of abstract thought. So like if you're reading nonfiction that is fairly complicated, like a medical journal or a manual. These are fairly complicated, concrete things. So I think, I don't know if there would be a difference between fiction and nonfiction. I think the important point there is to read something that may be challenging or something that involves, I don't know, that's an interesting question. I don't think anyone's looked into that, but I could definitely see potential for having a more imaginative reading experience could actually have different cognitive effects. So, yeah, another good question.
Yeah, and like you alluded to earlier, maybe it also depends on what you're most interested in, because you said it's important to do whatever you enjoy.
Exactly. I think I have a tough time personally getting into stories that didn't actually happen. I don't know what it is, but I'm definitely a grounded in reality person, I guess. So really trying to find a book that works for you, I guess.
Great. Okay, another interesting question for you. Is there any evidence of higher numbers of cognitive impairment in different ethnic groups or different areas of the world?
Yes, so that's a really good question. If you think back to my actually very first slide, I had that figure about the World Health Organization projection, the estimated number of people with dementia. Actually, I'm going to see if I can go back to that slide. Let's see here. This one. So this figure here, which again, does that look okay?
Yeah, there's just that square in the middle. Perfect. Yeah.
So this figure here, again from the World Health Organization, they suggest that the number of people with dementia is actually going to more heavily affect certain areas of the world. So these will be more predominantly low and middle income countries, which is will certainly be a challenge if they have less resources to cope with the care needs. And then in terms of actual ethnic groups, there is research to suggest that people, certain ethnic groups are more at risk for dementia, like African Americans, Latinos. If you think about research in the United States, they tend to be more at risk compared to Caucasian Americans. Although I don't know if this is necessarily an ethnic thing, but it could be more related to living situations. Again, like I had mentioned, dietary considerations. These people also tend to be at a bit more risk for diabetes, which is one of the risk factors for dementia. So hopefully that somewhat answers that question. It's a very big area of research, though, so there's a lot to unpack.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you, Nathan. So I'll make this the last question of the day. Thank you so much for all your really great questions, everyone. Okay, so last question for you, Nathan, is I wonder if you can speak to a high level of radiation and its impact on cognitive reserve.
Ooh, radiation. That is something that I would say has not been studied that much. Again, thankfully, because it's pretty rare in the general population to have people who have radiation exposure. There have been some kind of natural experiments looking in the regions around the Chernobyl nuclear plant. When that disaster happened, there are some people who were in middle adulthood at the time that seem to be a bit more at risk for dementia in that area, but they're also at risk for a number of other health conditions. So it seems like that exposure to radiation was a bad thing across the board. You might not be surprised. It's hard to see because that only happened, what, 1989? History is a little bad, but we'll see what effects that might have on people who are very young at the time, because that might actually be the most critical period for brain development, the people who are children and potentially exposed to radiation at that time. We won't find out for many years, but yes, there does seem to be somewhat of a link with radiation and dementia, but thankfully not very common.
Thank you so much, Nathan, for addressing all of these questions. I think you did a great job. I just wanted to quickly mention our First Link Dementia helpline that you can see up here on the slide. I've also included some links that you might be interested in for further reading. We have our Research Ready handout, the research section of our website, and the brain health section of our website, which really aligns nicely with a lot of the things Nathan talked about today, the importance of exercise, stimulating activities, and all of those things. So thank you so much, Nathan, for being here today. I can tell that there's a lot of thirst for this sort of knowledge, and thank you to our viewers who were really engaged and asked some great questions. Really appreciated it. So this is a great way to end the week on a Friday. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you so much, Nathan. So I'll just stay on here for a few more moments so that everyone can access these links if they need to. But thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.